The deadliest gangs in prison history, inside the most violent groups, the most dangerous gangs in the world, don't always operate on the streets. Some of them are locked behind concrete walls, where violence is more controlled, more calculated, and often more brutal. Inside these prisons, power isn't given. It's taken. And once it's taken, it's defended at any cost. In places where freedom no longer exists, something else takes its place: control. And the men who control prison life often belong to groups that history has come to fear. What happens when these gangs turn entire prisons into battlegrounds? And more importantly, how do inmates survive when neutrality is no longer an option? Because inside these walls, choosing the wrong side can cost you everything. And what happens next is even worse. Prisons are designed to strip away identity, uniform clothing, controlled movement, regulated speech. But over time, something unexpected happens. New identities are created, not by the system, but by the inmates themselves. And those identities often form around one central idea: protection. In the early days of incarceration, many inmates arrive alone. No allies, no reputation. And in prison, being alone is dangerous, very dangerous. So groups begin to form. At first, they're small, informal, based on shared backgrounds, race, neighborhood, language. But over time, these groups evolve. They become structured, organized, and eventually feared. Because in prison, strength comes in numbers, but power comes from organization. And some gangs perfected that better than anyone else. One of the earliest examples of this transformation came from within the walls of California's prison system. A group known as the Aryan Brotherhood, what started as a white inmate protection group, quickly evolved into something far more dangerous. They weren't just defending themselves. They were building an empire. Inside prison, the Aryan Brotherhood established a strict code: loyalty above all else. Betrayal meant death. Membership wasn't just about race. It was about commitment to violence, to control, and to a system where leaving wasn't an option. Because once you were in for life. But they weren't alone. Other groups began forming in response. The Mexican Mafia, the Black Guerrilla Family, each with their own rules, their own leadership, their own vision of power. And soon, prisons weren't just holding criminals anymore. They were holding entire criminal networks, each competing for dominance, each willing to use violence to maintain it. And the battleground? Every hallway, every cell block, every inch of concrete. To outsiders, prison might seem like a place of strict control. But inside, there's another system operating beneath the surface. A system built by inmates, for inmates, and controlled by gangs. In many prisons, gangs determine everything: where you sit, who you talk to, even whether you're allowed to exist without conflict, because neutrality is rarely respected. Communication happens quietly. Messages are passed through coded notes. Verbal exchanges disguised as casual conversation. Orders are given and followed without question, because within these gangs, hierarchy matters. At the top, leaders, often serving life sentences, run operations like corporations. Below them, lieutenants enforce rules. And at the bottom, soldiers carry out the violence. And if orders are ignored, punishment is swift and often permanent. Punishments inside gangs are not symbolic. They are physical: severe beatings, stabbings, isolation, and in some cases, execution. Because maintaining fear is part of maintaining control. And without control, the entire structure collapses. But here's the reality. Even the prison system itself sometimes struggles to break these structures, because gangs adapt. They evolve. They move operations through coded language, hidden networks, and external connections. In some cases, their influence reaches beyond prison walls, into cities, into streets, into entire communities. And what happens next reveals just how far that control can go. Violence in prison isn't always chaotic. Sometimes it's organized, calculated, even scheduled. Because for some gangs, violence isn't just a reaction. It's a tool used to send messages, to enforce rules, to eliminate threats. A single act of violence can shift the balance of power. One attack, one retaliation, one mistake, and suddenly entire prisons are on edge. Because in this environment, nothing happens in isolation. Every action has consequences, and those consequences spread quickly. Weapons inside prison are rarely sophisticated, but they don't need to be, because it's not about the weapon, it's about intent. And when violence is carried out by individuals trained within gang structures, it becomes precise, targeted, and often unavoidable. When violence escalates, prisons go into lockdown, cells are sealed, movement stops. But even lockdowns don't eliminate gang activity. They just change how it operates. Because when communication is restricted, gangs adapt. When movement is limited, they find new ways to act. And when pressure increases, so does the risk. For new inmates, entering this world is overwhelming, confusing, and dangerous. Because the first few days often determine everything. Who you align with, how you're perceived, whether you're seen as a target or something else. Some try to stay neutral, keep their heads down, avoid conflict. But in many prisons, that's not always possible, because gangs look for recruits, and refusal can be seen as disrespect or weakness. Others choose to join for protection, for belonging, for survival. But joining comes at a cost, because once you're in, you're expected to act, to follow orders, to prove loyalty. And sometimes that means doing things you can't take back. Daily life in prison follows a routine. Wake up, count, meals, work assignments, yard time, lockdown. But within that routine, gang influence shapes everything. Who eats where, who walks when, who's allowed to speak, and who isn't. At night, the prison quiets down, but the tension doesn't disappear. Because even in silence, the system is still active. Plans are made, orders are prepared, and somewhere someone is being watched. Because in this world, nothing goes unnoticed. Over the years, certain gangs have built reputations that extend far beyond prison walls. Names that carry weight, fear, and a history of violence that continues to shape prison systems today. The Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, the Black Guerrilla Family, each with its own origin, its own ideology, its own methods, but all connected by one thing: power. These groups didn't just survive inside prison. They thrived. They created systems, enforced rules, expanded influence, and in some cases operated like organized crime networks from behind bars. But power like this comes at a cost, because the more control a gang gains, the more resistance it creates, from rival groups, from prison authorities, from the system itself. And when that pressure builds, it doesn't disappear, it explodes. And what happens when that explosion comes is something few people truly understand, because the next chapter isn't just about control, it's about chaos. And the moments when everything breaks, there are moments when even the most controlled prison environments begin to crack. Tension builds slowly. Small conflicts, unpaid debts, disrespect, retaliation, and then something shifts. Because inside prison, violence doesn't always arrive with warning. Sometimes it erupts all at once. A single altercation can trigger something much larger, not just between individuals, but between entire groups. Because in gang-controlled environments, every conflict is connected. One fight becomes a message. One attack becomes a signal. And suddenly alliances activate. When riots break out, the structure that once kept order begins to disappear. Guards lose control of movement. Doors are forced open. Barriers are ignored. And inmates take over spaces that were never meant to be theirs. For those moments, the prison belongs to them. I end these situations. Gangs don't disappear. They become even more active. Leaders give rapid orders. Targets are identified. And violence becomes strategic. Because riots aren't just chaos. They're opportunities to settle scores, to eliminate rivals, to send messages that can't be ignored. For staff, These moments are among the most dangerous because control isn't just slipping, it's gone. Reinforcements are called, special response units move in, and slowly force is used to regain control. But by the time order is restored, the damage is already done. And in the aftermath, the prison changes. New power structures form, old alliances collapse, and those who survived adapt because inside prison, survival isn't just about avoiding violence. It's about understanding when it's coming. And what happens next reveals something even more dangerous than open conflict. Not all threats in prison come from rival gangs. Some come from within, because in environments built on loyalty, betrayal carries a different weight. Gangs rely on trust, on structure, on absolute obedience. But pressure changes people. Long sentences, isolation, fear, and sometimes self-preservation become stronger than loyalty. Information is power inside prison, and those who control it control everything. Some inmates begin sharing that information with rival gangs, or even with authorities, quietly, carefully, hoping it goes unnoticed. But it rarely does, because gangs watch their own members just as closely as they watch their enemies. Behavior changes are noticed. Conversations are remembered. Patterns are tracked. And when suspicion turns into certainty, the response is immediate. Betrayal inside prison doesn't lead to exile. There is no leaving, no second chances, only consequences. And those consequences are designed to send a message, not just to the individual, but to everyone else watching. Because in a world where trust is already fragile, betrayal threatens the entire structure. And to maintain control, it must be dealt with permanently. Because in a world where trust is already fragile, betrayal threatens the entire structure. And to maintain control, it must be dealt with permanently. But even loyalty has limits, because over time, something begins to happen inside these systems, something that changes everything. And what happens next is not about gangs. It's about evolution. Prison gangs are not static. They don't stay the same. They evolve because survival depends on it. Communication becomes more advanced. Codes replace language. Messages travel through unexpected channels. And information moves faster than ever, even in isolation. But the most significant shift happens beyond prison walls, because many of these gangs don't stop operating when members are incarcerated. They expand, using connections outside, associates on the streets, networks that continue their influence. Orders are passed outward. Decisions made inside prison affect actions outside. And suddenly, the line between prison and society begins to blur. Authorities recognize this, and efforts are made to disrupt these networks. Isolation units, restricted communication, increased surveillance. But gangs adapt to that too, because every restriction creates a new method. Every barrier creates a workaround. And over time, these groups become more than just prison gangs. They become systems, structured, resilient, and difficult to dismantle. Release from prison is often seen as an end, a return to freedom, a second chance. But for many gang-affiliated inmates, it's not that simple, because gang ties don't always disappear. They follow into neighborhoods, into communities, into everyday life. Those symbols still matter. Those connections still exist. And those expectations remain. Some try to leave that life behind, to disconnect, to rebuild. But leaving a gang is rarely easy, because membership wasn't temporary. It was permanent. And for others, the influence continues. Orders are still followed. Roles are still played, just in a different environment, which means the impact of prison gangs doesn't stay contained. It spreads through systems, through networks, through lives that extend far beyond incarceration. Prisons were built to contain crime, to separate it from society, to control it. But inside those walls, something else was created, a system within a system, built by inmates, controlled by gangs, maintained through power, and enforced through fear. These groups didn't just survive. They adapted. They organized, they expanded, and in many cases, they became stronger because the reality is prison doesn't always end criminal networks. Sometimes it refines them. And behind those walls right now, the system continues. New inmates arrive, new alliances form, new conflicts begin, and somewhere inside, power is shifting. Quietly, constantly, and often violently, because in the end, the most dangerous gangs in prison history aren't just defined by what they've done, but by the fact that they're still there,